you come back to a problem of that we face of this global plan to wreck every nation. It was in the 1901 plan that I've spoken with you and your audience about before, that a shadow government was to be placed around not just the United States, but around the government of every nation, so that it would be weakened over time and gradually so weak that it could simply be pulled down, because you have operatives within every department of government. You have its currency weakened. You have all these kind of things, and you pull the string at the same time, and the world falls into your hands. That was their stated, published plan back in 1901, and our own press has kept that from us. Our academics have kept that from us all these years, and it has worked around to the game plan almost to the date. They haven't, so far as we know, figured out how to poison as many people as they need to immediately, as they said they needed to do by 2000. But maybe they have. Maybe they just haven't pulled the trigger yet. But this is a cabal that wishes us as much evil as you can imagine. And they have said so on paper, and our elected leadership has embraced those objectives in the past. Theodore Roosevelt did. Franklin Roosevelt certainly did. The ones in between, in some way or other, have. Otherwise, they've been shot and killed.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions. Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a distinguished returning guest, Wayne Jett. He is an attorney who has argued cases up to and including at the U.S. Supreme Court. He's a constitutional scholar. He is the author of the book, The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now, and an expert on the Great Depression of the U.S., as well as dynamics from that continue to affect us to this day. He's also the founder of ClassicalCapital.com. Wayne, thanks for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Very glad to be here, Duncan. Thanks for having me.
You get requested back by our viewers. As soon as we have you on, they say, when are you going to get Mr. Jett back on? It's like, we just had him on. So they wanted you back, and I thought a great reason to do so would be a recent article that you forwarded called Monetary Policy Endgame, Central Banks to Fight Fake, quote, Deflation. And you were talking in there about some of the dynamics about zero interest rates and negative interest rates. And I wonder if you can tell us what you see as the key concerns in this regard. It's certainly something that's been on the minds of a lot of our guests and a lot of our audience.
Well, it's been on the horizon for some time as to exactly what the confrontation was going to be like and when. As to, I've been calling for ending the Fed, as you know, for quite a long time. Practically every time I am on to talk with your audience,
right,
and you. And I certainly haven't changed that, but I think it's been pretty clear from the beginning that it's not going to be an easy time. It's not going to be something that we do all the time, and therefore no sweat. It will be a difficult time. What I've been seeing and talking about in previous discussions with you has been, I think, the president preparing for that eventuality by trying to balance our trade account, our current account, and our trade with other international traders, so that we sell as much as we buy, therefore not draining wealth out of the country. Because, as we've said before, when that happens continuously, as it has been since the late 90s, We have been draining wealth out of this country, which is why that wealth has come back in the pockets of foreign nationals and bought a great amount of assets in the United States. People have seen that all over the place, whether it's homes or commercial properties or whatever, other kinds of businesses. But if we're going to go to a sound currency, as I've advocated for all of our discussions, we have to be able to sell as much as we buy so that we don't send all of our wealth out in the form of gold and therefore have nothing to send the next time if we go to a gold-backed currency. And a point to be made about that is that it sounds very antiquated in today's parlance because our fake news and our education system has put us in the position of really not realizing that the best time the world has ever seen has been the years that we spent under the gold standard. We've spent more time under the gold standard than we certainly have under the dollar, at least since the dollar has left the gold standard. Mm-hmm. I would classify that technically as since 1933, when as soon as sworn into office, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, ordered that all Americans turn in their gold, which that action by itself, just saying exchange all of your gold for currency, took away the mechanism that says this little piece of paper that we're giving you for your work, you can turn in any time at the rate of $20.67 and get gold in your pocket. That's the method by which our currency system at that time promised people that they would get actual value, something that would actually be exchanged for work of the value that they did at a very prompt arrangement, such as simply taking it to your bank and exchanging the currency for the gold anytime you want. That's what it had been up to that point. We have not had that since then, even though supposedly we acted like we were still on the gold standard until 1971. And then in 1972, the dollar was officially floated. That is, it was not tied to any price of gold nor to any target of gold, supposedly. But in those circumstances, you put that all together, and the history of the world has been, the history of the middle class has been, that is, all of the people who were able to support themselves, the middle class, in the classical sense, they had their best years in the history of the world under the gold standard for the 150 years, at least, before our gold standard was taken away from us. And the middle class grew like it had never grown before. And that, of course, is, as we've talked before, that inspired such a fear in the ruling cabal, the kingmakers cabal that has ruled all nations of the world, or tried to since centuries ago, farther back than I can document. But in any event, they decided to do away with the middle class, and a big part of that was their goal to do away with the gold standard, which they were able to get started by buying off the Princeton University former president, Woodrow Wilson, when he was elected in the 1912 election. He had promised not to abandon the gold standard. He had promised not to establish a central bank. And he promised not to do a graduated income tax, all of which were parts explicitly of the design of the kingmakers cabal to destroy the middle class. All three of those things were a part of that plan explicitly. They stated so, 1901, and so since that time, it's been a steady move away from the gold standard. And the gold standard is so important not because of that gold that you need in your pocket, It's to make certain that the currency that we have accomplishes its most important characteristic, and that is never to change value. Stability in your currency is exactly what you want. Our people have been taught for all these years that, oh, my goodness, we need some inflation to help things grow. Otherwise, it's just stagnant. False, absolutely false. It always winds up creating a cyclical kind of downturn or crash or something of the sort. And most importantly, it allows the bankers that are creating this fake currency, this unreliable currency, this false promise currency that you're going to get something equal to the value that you gave for it, whether it's your labor or your production or whatever it is. That's the big lie. And every fiat currency tried in the world has always had the same game plan. It has been to continue as long as possible with the game plan, gradually reducing the value of the currency, so that as long as you're doing that, the people furnishing the currency can slip as much to themselves as they want and buy up hard assets with it. When people think it still has value, they get all those hard assets in their possession, in their ownership, and then when they pull the plug on the currency, they own everything and nobody else has anything. You have everyone else impoverished, and the bankers, or the ones who own the banks, they're not really the bankers, they're the owners, the kingmakers. They have everything in their hands and they have total power. That's what has been the design. Let me just go back into the 1700s for a second and immediately remind people there were two failures of fiat currency in France within the 18th century. There was one at the beginning of the 1700s and another at the end of the 1700s. The second one is the one where all the beheading was done, because
French Revolution, yeah.
I mean, two in the same century is more than a people can take, apparently. In any event, both of them went to zero. Both of them left the people completely impoverished despite their hard work. And so they tried to make an impression this shouldn't be done again. Well, I'm sorry to say, all of us are in that boat now in terms of using a fiat currency, at least since 1972, in which it has no promised value. It floats and is simply determined by the psychology of the marketplace as to how much it can buy. And so what we have here now, what inspired to the extent it was, that particular article was a written article by one of the CIOs, chief investment officers of BlackRock, the largest of the hedge funds investors in the U.S., reputedly, wrote an article that says, oh my goodness, it looks like the end game is here. Because it certainly is apparent that the Federal Reserve, as well as other central banks of the world, are going to be fighting. They're going to be flooding the market with currency, more volumes of currency, because they have no choice. They have to do that to fight inflation, and particularly, fight deflation.
Deflation, yeah.
Fighting deflation. And why can we say with a straight face that there's deflation? Because every other currency in the world has decided that in order to trade with the United States, they have to inflate their currency faster than we inflate ours. Otherwise, they could get caught in deflation. And when they get caught in deflation, they've just had recent experiences with that. When their currencies don't go down in value as fast as the dollar does, then all the loans they have is much more costly for them to repay, and breaks their economies. So in that circumstances, all the other currencies are trying to inflate faster than the dollar, and therefore, in order for the dollar not to deflate and therefore supposedly hurt our trade, we have to inflate just as fast as everybody else, and we take it to zero, all in the name of doing something really honorable and good for the American economy. It is a death wish for the entire world in terms of economic development and economic prosperity, in terms of the honesty to the people who are doing the work. It is a game plan designed to make certain that the people doing the work wind up with no value, because all they will have access to will be paper currency that's worthless. So in that circumstance, I had to comment on the point that it can only be a Keynesian-based economic system that with a straight face can say you can create, you've got to create more currency to make it go to zero faster in order to save the people and the currency and the economic system. And these are the people, as I've said before, these are the people who say that you have to be illiterate in macroeconomics in order to suggest that a gold standard system would be better for us than this paper fiat currency that we've suffered with every day and year we've had it, certainly since '71. It's been a travesty, but really it was the same circumstance since really 33, and particularly 44, 45 again, when we went on the Bretton Woods system that was still supposedly gold-based. Well, it wasn't gold-based for Americans, because Americans were prohibited from owning gold, particularly, but they would sell all the gold that FDR bought during the Great Depression to bankrupt our country and make sure there was such outrageously bad deflation that nobody had any money. Everybody was starving or close to it, except for those who had the money to start with and were in on the scheme to cause the crash and cause the depression. In those circumstances, Americans have been without the gold standard since at least 33, and we would be better off back on it as soon as possible. It's just a matter of how smoothly can we get there. Now, there was one other thing that I mentioned in that article. This is really not particularly news so much because, yes, it's been spoken about for some time that the bankers, the central bankers of the world, certainly don't want to lose the action that they've had for these many years in more or less managing all the economies of the world. And so they're working on a new scheme or a new design for the international monetary system that would allow them to stay in control. And as many have been suggesting or predicting, one of their ideas has been to, well, let's use a Bitcoin. It sure looks like gold on the computer screens, and it looks like a coin. But so they've come up with an idea, have had kicking around for some time, that, well, they will use a cryptocurrency to be the international monetary system that everybody can use and have confidence on, and it's got the blockchain to assure the owner that they have that ownership and so forth and so on. It can't be broken, very dependable and so forth. Well, I have to differ, as you know, from that viewpoint. In my estimation, the design of the cryptocurrencies, including the one that the international bankers spoke about, I think it was in Jackson Hole just recently, Wyoming, at a conference. The outgoing head of the Bank of England made this proposal that there needs to be a new system, that the dollar is coming apart and can't last much longer, and so we need to be ready to move to a new paradigm, and the new paradigm is to be a cryptocurrency managed by the central banks, and it should be multipolar, as they say. That is, more than one bank, not just the Fed, should be managing it, because other economies are more important now and more powerful and so forth and so on. Well, you put all that together, they're coming closer to the point of recognizing we do have a fight on our hands with the Fed and with Trump. Trump is interested in getting to a new monetary system. I've been saying for some time, I believe that he's interested in getting to a gold-backed system. But in order to do that, we must balance the current account, balance our trade system. That's why he's working so hard in getting this China deal to stop allowing China to sell $500 billion more a year to us than we sell to them. It's not a trade war. It's a matter simply of negotiation of a fair trading arrangement that any nation over the past centuries, as a bottom line in your trade negotiations, you want a balanced trade relationship with your trading partners. It's only fair, and it's the only way you can survive economically.
Sustainable, yeah.
Yes. And so in that circumstance, we have those two straws in the wind, you might say, that the showdown is coming. In some respects, it can be read as an indication that, yes, the bankers are going to go to the mat on bringing down Trump, and they'll do it by crashing the U.S. economy, and doing that rather than by causing deflation to wreck it. They will cause inflation to take the dollar to zero, and in that circumstance, we'll have such chaos that he will not be reelected to office. Now, I think we may have spoken the last time we were together about the point that maybe we haven't spoken since Mr. Dudley, former New York Fed president, and therefore vice chairman of the Federal Open Market Committee, setting monetary policy for the last 10 years. He had actually written an editorial in the Wall Street Journal saying that most certainly the Fed has a responsibility, and it's within its purview to decide that it's a very bad thing for the United States of America to have Donald Trump as president, and therefore should do what they need to do, what they must do in order to make certain that he doesn't get reelected. Now, that caused eyebrows to raise, as if the Fed has always been non-political and stayed out of political matters and so forth, which is absolutely false. They've been hotly involved in all sorts of ways in political matters, and how much more political can it be than to help select presidential candidates, help make sure they're elected. Consider Paul Volcker, for example, in 1979, deciding that they wouldn't regulate the interest rate any longer. They would go to a money volume approach toward managing the dollar's value, and appointed in October of 79, just before Jimmy Carter's run for re-election as president. He pumped so much money into the economy that he blew the gold price from below $300 an ounce to $892 within about 6 months, 6 to 9 months, and wrecked the economy so badly that time. It makes me wonder whether he was trying to reelect him or trying to make sure he didn't get reelected. But nevertheless, it certainly wound up ushering Carter out of office, and I suspect helping Ronald Reagan be elected. But nevertheless, the Fed has always been involved from 1913. It's been involved in presidential races, not so much in your face as this recent thing by Dudley is indicating they should be, and as Dudley himself has demonstrated. But they are highly political. They are all over the world. Their owners are highly political. They seek to control every government in the world. If you can't get politics within that definition of their aims, and I'm not sure how you do it, because it's certainly the case.
The introductory sentence of your article that we quoted at the beginning says, central banks of the world, also known as, quote, the Rothschild banks, quote, including the Federal Reserve, always have the same end game in mind, to take to zero the purchasing value of the fiat currency each bank produces, and goes on from there. Could you touch for a moment on, because you just came back to that point about who the real owners are of the central banks of the world, and just to dispel any misconception that reasonable people might have that our Central Bank of the United States is not an American institution?
I'd be happy to do that. Thanks for asking. Well, on the first place, the only part of the Federal Reserve that can be anything close to accurate while saying that it's a federal agency is no more than the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors is a fig leaf authorized by legislation, by which there's a Board of Governors that supposedly is in charge of the Fed. They are therefore, since they have a federal statute providing for their selection and nomination and their meetings from time to time, they're treated as if they're an agency. Everything else about the Fed that's important, that really is important, is privately owned. For example, the 12 Federal Reserve banks, including most importantly, by far, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, is a private corporation. They're chartered under federal law, just like most corporations are chartered under state law, but they are privately owned. They issue stock. Those who buy their stock are private stockholders, and their private stockholders elect their officers, they elect their board of directors, they elect their CEO and president, which Mr. William C. Dudley certainly knows that very well, because he served as CEO and president of the New York Fed, privately owned, privately elected officer for 10 years or maybe 12, but he took over when Tim Geithner left the office, the same position of president and CEO of the New York Fed, to become Treasury Secretary when President Obama was elected. Dudley stepped into his shoes and served those 8 years plus the first 2 years of the Trump administration, all in that position, and then for some reason stepped away from it. But those are private banking officials. All of their stockholders that they answer to, that vote for them to be in that position, are private companies or private organizations. They're the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the very large wealth holders of the world that have been part of the global cabal for as far back as I can trace. And it is those people and their other centers of power. Certainly the Fed is not their only center of power in the world. There are centers of power such as the Bank of England, the City of London, which is much like Washington, D.C. to some extent, something apart from the country. The City of London is not subject to the laws of Britain and the Parliament. It is basically a power unto itself, much as the Vatican is in Italy. I mean, it's not in Italy, it happens to be on the same peninsula, but it by itself is a different country, subject to no laws of any other country other than its own. And so those kinds of power centers just happen to be centers that control very, very large amounts of the wealth that has been accumulated in the world. And it's really remarkable that circumstance can be the case when so much wealth is controlled in by such a few number of people, and the people of the world have so little wealth produced by all of their efforts and answerable to the currency that they are allowed to put in their pockets. That is essentially the circumstance that we're facing with the Federal Reserve. It's hard to say what the Federal Reserve's wealth is because they don't allow themselves to be audited. My guess is that the Federal Reserve in and of itself is more or less like a shell corporation. Now, it puts out some statements which we're not allowed to audit, and we've talked about those before, which show themselves to be more or less balanced with liabilities of the size of their assets. Just a few dollars more on their assets than their liabilities, I might say. But as I've pointed out previously in articles on my website, the amount of their liabilities, even though they state that part of the substantial part of their liability are the liabilities that they have to pay value for their notes, that is the dollars that we're using. Mm-hmm. Those are actually Federal Reserve notes that are promissory notes, and they recognize something over $3 trillion in liabilities to pay back the value of those notes. I've estimated that the liabilities for their notes that are outstanding have got to be at least $30-40 trillion, and certainly they don't show the assets enough to cover those. I would say that that's probably far understating the face value of the Federal Reserve notes that are outstanding around the world. And so they are not a sound financial institution at all as far as the Federal Reserve is concerned. Their Federal Reserve banks, I think, are in the same boat. I seriously doubt that they have the gold to back up their liabilities that they have for the Federal Reserve notes that they put out. The reason they are Federal Reserve notes, they are paper promises to give you something of value because they are getting something of value in exchange for the notes they put out for you. They're getting either real estate or they're getting a treasury note, treasury security that promises to pay them certain amounts. And in those circumstances, they have this tremendous liability, much more than the assets they're willing to admit having. And I think a large part of that is probably because even more than the assets, the liabilities that we know about in terms of dollars put out, almost certainly in my mind, they have put out many more trillions of dollars to their owners out the back door, which are never audited, and those are used by their owners to buy up hard assets, while those dollars or notes are still supposedly worth some value. And once they crash the economy and the ordinary people go into some kind of chaotic crisis, they're in the position of controlling their assets, controlling their properties, warding off people from bothering them, and then setting up new governments to control the people to do their bidding again once they've got the chaos under the control of their military capabilities or whatever they have. Now, that's the dismal view of the circumstances that have faced societies in past centuries, past years, even this century and the last century for smaller countries. There's certainly been plenty of those whose currencies have failed, but we haven't seen it. What I believe that we're seeing presently under President Trump is a determined effort to get to the point of having a sound currency before the dollar crashes, and to get to the point of replacing the Federal Reserve note with a sound currency, one that's controlled fully by the U.S. Treasury, that would replace dollars so far as our economy is concerned with a balanced current account. We would then be able to proceed with a stable currency the way many other of the major trading countries of the world already are moving. China is among those. They know what our problem is. We need to get to a sound currency, just as they're wishing to do so by having gold backing for their currency and getting into a position that they no longer have to accept paper for the goods that they are getting produced by their country. One of the very valid points that President Trump is making in these trade negotiations, that I feel sure that China recognizes the validity of it. Politically, whether they're willing to do it, I'm not sure. But their great trade advantage in trading with the United States is that they require their people to work at such low wages that they can easily undersell any manufacturer in the United States for the trade arrangements that we've had in the past. They've been allowed to do that, and it's bankrupted us. It's caused a great outflow of wealth from our country to theirs, and so that needs to be brought into proper reconciliation. I think it's going to be. I think there's good reason to think that those talks are further along, and that that China is more amenable to a reasonable solution for us than some suggest when they say that China is really looking to dominate the world and do it militarily if necessary. I don't think that's necessarily the case, and I think there's a good chance that we're going to have a good outcome rather than bad, but not with the help of the central banks. The central banks are going to have to go. That's basically where we are, and the central bank that affects us most is certainly the Federal Reserve, as it's called, and so that should be in our relatively near future. Whether it can get past the election next year, I don't know. I'm not sure whether it needs to get past the election. It may be that we're farther along that we can make the change before then. But this threat that came partly through Dudley and partly through these more recent papers and speeches, that the dollar's going to zero because of this money we're going to flood into the world, that to me makes it appear that they want to crash the dollar before he can get into a position of having a sound currency. I'm still optimistic about it.
A couple things in what you just described come to mind. One is during the real estate collapse of 2007, 2008, 2009, people were noticing that folks who had taken on mortgages but then couldn't service them because they got laid off, that sort of thing, and their mortgages went upside down, that sort of thing. Sometimes those properties got foreclosed on, they got owned by the banks. So now you've got, and the Federal Reserve even bought up a whole bunch of those assets, even though they talked over the last couple of years about a good game about unwinding their balance sheet, so to speak. They're holding a lot of, at least what we know of, a lot of real estate mortgages, that sort of thing. And so the dynamic that you described of the bankers driving the currency down and basically undermining the middle class and ending up at the end of the game owning all the the real assets, in this case, for example, residential real estate, etc., certainly seems to ring true in that case. The other one was where you talked about the dynamic of our relationship with China, where over the last few decades, I've heard multiple people say, oh, how clever of us in the U.S. Luckily, we have the world reserve currency of the dollar because we can just send them worthless dollars, and what they send us is real things like cars and washing machines and televisions and computers. And aren't we clever? Because we get the real things and they get promissory notes that aren't worth anything. But it seems like now that the whatever we're draining the swamp or whatever we're doing, it seems like these perishable consumer goods that we had accumulated over the years. What do they all end up in landfills, and because their useful life is over. But you see Chinese fortunes from John Adams, for example, in Australia, saying that Chinese businessmen coming down and buying up all the real estate that they can get their hands on in Australia. We've heard the same about Hawaii. We've heard the same about businesses across the U.S. and that sort of thing. So, and rather than militarily, other analysts, John Casey and among others, have talked about China forming economic alliances with countries all over the world, in Africa and Brazil and so on, and building out infrastructure, real infrastructure in their own country and in other countries, and basically building themselves into a much more powerful position as a sustaining superpower for the next century. So could you just touch on those two cases? Is it true that the Federal Reserve, actually the central banks have in fact taken ownership of a lot of real property in the country, while many people have lost control of that property and become renters and so on?
Well, I think they have all sorts of properties, whether it's the major office buildings in New York City, Manhattan, and so forth, industrial parks all over the country, commercial buildings, many residences, the great residences of the U.S. in large part. But all of that is a part of the pattern that China was taking advantage of, that the ruling elite, the global cabal, the kingmakers cabal, their game plan is to crash every nation and have a global dictatorship. That means the U.S. American government has got to go. We're the major target because we've had the predominant military in the world. We've had the predominant prosperous economy in years past. We've had people who strongly support their voting representative form of government, their constitutional government. And so we're the nut to crack there, and China has been a willing part of it. If you're going to allow your fiat currency to be used against us, we're going to take advantage of it, and we'll simply be a part of owning your country, and we'll be owning every other country as well, because we can go in and use that currency. We can sell our goods cheaper than anybody else in the world, because we have people that will require to work more cheaply than any place else. And in that circumstance, you come back to a problem of that we face of this global plan to wreck every nation. It was in the 1901 plan that I've spoken with you and your audience about before, that a shadow government was to be placed around not just the United States, but around the government of every nation, so that they would be weakened over time, and gradually so weak that it could simply be pulled down, because you have operatives within every department of government. You have its currency weakened, you have all these kind of things, and you pull the string at the same time, and the world falls into your hands. That was their stated, published plan back in 1901, and our own press has kept that from us. Our academics have kept that from us all these years, and it has worked around to the game plan almost to the date. They haven't, so far as we know, figured out how to poison as many people as they need to immediately, as they said they needed to do by 2000. But maybe they have. Maybe they just haven't pulled the trigger yet. But this is a cabal that wishes us as much evil as you can imagine. And they have said so on paper, and our elected leadership has embraced those objectives in the past. Theodore Roosevelt did. Franklin Roosevelt certainly did. The ones in between, in some way or other, have. Otherwise, they've been shot and killed. And it goes back even before 1901, doing such things. 20 years before 1901, they shot Garfield because he was going to refinance the debt of the United States and get rid of the charlatans, the global bankers that were robbing us dry, and was shot within 3 months, I think, after he took office. Wasn't successfully shot, and so his doctors infected him enough that over a period of about 3 months he died of infection, when they were very well advised by other nations that infection was a serious problem when you have gunshot wounds. So in any event, we're near the end game. We have a wonderful time and experience that we are within right now. We have a counterattack going against this cabal. I've said it before, and it is ongoing. I'm convinced more about it every day, and I think we're getting closer and closer to more substantial evidence that we are in fact winning. And I think people around the world are ecstatic about it. I hear from them quite often. Your audience and other people are in other countries watching us closely, watching President Trump closely, and many of them have high hopes for their own countries. If we can make it work here, I think they believe that they're getting help from our country already in their own, in order to throw off the controls and the just sinister objectives that this cabal has exercised for so long against every country in the world. So I have a great appreciation for my chance to talk with your audience, Dunnigan, and share with them some of these prospects.
We'll put the link. Yeah, we'll put the link to your article in the description of this video, because I think people will find that to be a great read. And also, just on your website, classicalcapital.com, you've got a whole bunch of recent articles that are along similar thought process that helps to lay out some of what you just alluded to. Can you give us a quick understanding, just for the 1 minute, when you refer to this 1901 document about the globalists' agenda that we haven't been taught about? Where can people find out more about that?
Well, you can find out about it certainly in my book. You don't get to it until the time I got to it in my writing. It's chapter 17, the second half of chapter 17, in fact. Well, the first half for that part of it. Another part of the world was describing the same kind of thing. And the operative that we had in our White House at the time of the Great Depression, that was the chief operative of imposing the Great Depression on the world. I want to just impose on you for 1 second to say that I had a great honor recently. The man who was the first public figure to review my book and write a review of it was Robert David Steele. I think you're well acquainted with him yourself. In any event, he had done that review and was instrumental in my getting my first interviews on YouTube. And just recently, he announced that he had been commissioned to give a speech of the most important, life-changing, transformative, I think he calls it, books that he had read in his life. He's reviewed over 2,000 books, and he named this book as one of the 25 transformative, life-changing books.
Wow.
It's because it tells the truth about the Great Depression and all of our experiences in that regard. So, great. I'm happy to be able to talk with you, Dunnigan. And it's $25. It's on my website. I got thrown off of Amazon as soon as it got so popular that I couldn't quite keep up with shipping until I got a new printing. And all the better. My website, it's $25, hardback, sewn bound, not just glued. And so that's my 60 seconds. And I'm just thrilled with this inclusion of my book with these other great books.
Yeah, what an honor.
I certainly consider it as such.
We've been speaking with Wayne Jett, the author of Fruits of Graft, Great Depression Then and Now, and the founder of ClassicalCapital.com, where you can find his articles. Wayne, thanks as always for joining us again here on Reluctant Preppers.
Glad to be here.
Hey, Reluctant Preppers, if you want to hear more of Wayne Jett and bonus footage from other guests we've had on, come on over right now to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers and access that bonus footage there. Take care. With surprising new concerns expressed about Dunnigan's changing hairstyle, one viewer even commented that hair is dyed, fried, and laid to the side. But what you're not being told is Dunnigan's hair needs no dye thanks to the wonderful vitamin and mineral regimen that Melody recommends, and is not laid to the side to cover any bald spot either, since Dunnigan's full head of hair is exceptionally well attached. However, Dunnigan does use hair products only as a disaster prevention because he's at severe risk of catastrophic emergency situations. But although there may be some changes you don't like to hair, this is one kind of change you'll definitely want to have on hand if the situation gets hairy. Pure silver. And for a limited time, your first ounce of silver can be purchased at spot price with free shipping on orders over $99 by going to sdbullion.com/rp. And you'll be supporting Reluctant Preppers as well. It's within your grasp to get your hands on the perfect change for hairy situations at sdbullion.com/rp. P.S. Dunnigan was not harmed in the making of this video.